Hey guys, tonight we set sail for frosty fjords, steaming hearths, and long houses where history forgot to mention half the population. You'll trudge through snowy fields with a spindle in one hand and a goat in the other, only to realize you're the one holding down the entire Viking economy while the lads are off yelling at monks. And trust me, you probably won't survive this if you can't churn butter with one hand while slapping a lawbreaker with the other. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fun to see who's dozing off in which time zone. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the shadow of a turf-roofed longhouse, smoke curling gently from its wooden chimney. It's early morning in a Viking village, let's say Hedeby, or maybe a hamlet near Trondheim, and the air smells like cold moss fish and burnt porridge. Chickens cluck somewhere nearby. You're not a warrior sharpening a blade or a skald composing poems. No, tonight, you're a woman of the Norse world, and this frostbitten patch of earth is your domain. Contrary to what sword and horned helmet myths might suggest, most Viking women weren't waiting in castles for brave warriors to return. They were busy. And I don't mean puttering with herbs busy. I mean managing livestock textile production and small political economies busy. In Viking society, the farm wasn't just the heart of daily life. It was a battleground of skill and respect. When the men left for sea, women didn't just hold down the fort. They became its rulers. Every morning you stir the fire milk, the sheep set the bread dough, and check that the household slaves haven't run off with your best iron pot. Yes, slavery was a normalized part of Norse life. Not pleasant, but historically accurate. You also managed the livestock roster like a feudal Excel spreadsheet. A sick cow means fewer winter supplies. A lazy thrall means extra chores for your daughter. And no one wants that, not even your daughter. The division of labor was clear, but not hierarchical. You spun wool, not because it was women's work, but because clothes literally kept people alive. Textile production in Viking society was no joke. Historians still argue whether certain dye recipes were considered proprietary secrets passed down like family heirlooms. What's certain is this: without your loom and dyed threads, your husband would be freezing on some rock near Lindisfarne. And don't forget, weaving wasn't just economic, it was symbolic. The Norse believed in the Norns' female beings who wove the threads of fate. So yes, when you sit down to the loom, you're not just making a tunic, you're channeling cosmic power. And with a toddler chewing on a pig's ear in the background, that's probably the most divine moment of your day. You might also be brewing ale. Because Viking ale wasn't merely a beverage, it was currency morale booster and social glue. You'd ferment barley and herbs in a big cauldron while humming a tune your grandmother taught you. It bubbles away in the corner like a second child you trust slightly more than your firstborn. Some scholars even speculate that female brewers, or alewives, had status and social mobility tied directly to their brewing prowess. So yes, your beer mattered. Lunch is dried fish and barley porridge. Your son complains, and you remind him Odin once survived on mead and mushrooms so he can deal. You're clever that way. Viking women were expected to be sharp-tongued and resourceful. The sagas are full of mothers who outwit chieftains, manipulate suitors, and plot vengeance like it's a sport. In a world where survival meant outthinking wolves, winters and wandering husbands' wit was a survival skill. And speaking of wandering husbands, there's a strong chance your spouse is gone half the year. Raiding maybe, trading possibly, marooned in Scotland entirely plausible. So you become de facto head of household. You handle disputes, manage debt payments, and even perform small ritual blessings, especially if the village seeress is away. You also participate in seasonal rituals. During midsummer, you might hang charms for fertility near the hearth. During Yule, you'd bake sacred bread loaves, each marked with runes for protection. Some of these customs predate even the Norse gods whispered down from Bronze Age grandmothers who saw too many winters. By sunset, your back aches, your apron stained with lard and ash, and you've yelled at 3 different people today, none of whom were listening. But as the fire crackles and the goats stop bleeding, you sit by the loom and take one last look at the evening sky. The same stars your husband might be sailing under, the same stars your grandmother taught you to read. You feel proud, tired, and maybe just a little magical. And that's just day one. You're holding a ring of keys, and if you lived in Viking Age Scandinavia, everyone around you knows exactly what that means. You're in charge. Those keys jingle at your waist, looped onto your apron by a braided woolen cord. They're not the jangly, forgettable house keys we toss into modern purses. These are thick iron things, handmade, rust-touched, and symbolic. To carry keys in Viking society wasn't just practical, it was political. It meant you controlled the household stores, the locked chests, and in many ways, the fate of the family's economy. In the Norse legal imagination, the woman of the house was its manager, steward, and sometimes even its banker. When the husband was away, whether for weeks or years, your set of keys confirmed your authority. And no, this wasn't some cozy domestic title like Queen of the Home. This was logistical warfare. You kept track of everything from grain silos to brooch collections. Historians still argue whether key-carrying women had legal guardianship over children and younger kin. But evidence from graves and law codes suggests they at least wielded soft power, the power of knowing where everything was, who owed what, and whether the cheese cave was fermenting correctly. Don't laugh. Bad cheese meant winter illness, and winter illness meant death. So yes, that key to the cellar might be more vital than a sword. And these weren't skeleton key situations. Some keys opened grain chests, others opened jewelry boxes, still others unlocked the door to your family's burial gifts. Some were even ceremonial, worn more for status than for actual use. Picture yourself walking into a village feast with your keys clinking like a badge of office. Everyone sees them. Everyone hears them. And no one dares ask where the pickled herring is stored without your say-so. In some legal texts, women could represent their absent husbands in disputes involving land and livestock. Imagine squinting across a frost-covered field at some sniveling neighbor named Bjorn who claims your goats wandered onto his land. You know better. You step forward, keys swinging, and quote the precise boundaries your father-in-law dictated when he planted that birch tree 30 years ago. Your authority isn't questioned. Even in death, keys mattered. Archaeologists have found them in women's graves, sometimes clutched in skeletal hands, sometimes laid reverently atop woven belts. They've turned up alongside beads, bronze brooches, and sometimes even weapons. And here's a fringe theory. Some researchers believe those burial keys might have symbolized access to the afterlife. Because what's more Viking than needing a lockpick to get into Valhalla? One particular grave found in Birka, Sweden, included a high-born woman with elaborately designed keys and a chest full of foreign goods, peacock feathers, silks, and spices. Clearly, she wasn't just the keeper of pickled onions. She was a node in the Norse trade network, a woman who opened doors both literal and metaphorical. And let's talk about treasure chests. Norse homes weren't stuffed with closets and cabinets. Valuables were stored in wood and iron chests, often locked. Some had compartments, hidden trays, even secret panels. Guess who managed the keys? Not your raiding Uncle Sven. It was you. You who knew where the silver armbands were hidden. You who decided whether your youngest son deserved that amber comb or not. A keeper of treasure. A domestic dragon, if you will. This key culture extended into storytelling. In several sagas, disputes begin when women are denied access to a chest or suspected of mismanaging household stores. These weren't petty dramas. They were the Viking equivalent of financial scandal. Imagine the local gossip if someone claimed you'd lost the ale-fermenting key. Scandalous. One tale from the Laxdella saga describes a woman named Gudrun, who after a series of unfortunate marriages became so powerful in her community that people sought her judgment in matters of honor and property. She didn't fight with swords. She fought with words, memory, and her uncanny ability to recall dowry terms from decades ago. Of course, power had its limits. Your keys didn't unlock public assembly or decide the outcome of legal duels. But within your turf-roofed empire, they gave you teeth. And sometimes you did bite. Consider the case of women refusing to give their sons inheritance without a properly performed ritual, or locking out a disobedient husband from the sleeping quarters until he reconsidered his tone. Passive-aggressive, maybe. Politically savvy, absolutely. Now picture evening falling. You walk through your longhouse, checking latches, securing shutters, whispering instructions to the youngest daughter who's eyeing the pantry a little too eagerly. Then you unlock the chest where tomorrow's feast is stored. The key clicks, and for just a moment, everything is under your control. Because when the keys are on your belt, the house is yours. You tighten your grip on the rough edge of your round shield eyes, scanning the darkened coastline. Somewhere out there, a ship is landing. Or maybe it's nothing. The seagulls have been jumpy lately, and your brother did say something about the thrill of imagining battle where there's only wind. But you're ready, or at least you think you are, because tonight you're a Viking shield maiden? Or are you, the legendary Viking woman warrior, the shield maiden? She's been painted in modern pop culture as a braided blade-swinging juggernaut, her hair too flawless for someone who just beheaded a Saxon. And sure, it's a compelling image. But did shield maidens actually exist? That, my friend, is the question historians are still arguing about, and they've been at it for over a century. Let's start with the sagas. These were written a couple hundred years after the Viking Age by Icelandic authors with flair for drama. In texts like the Saga of the Volsungs or Hervarar, saga shield maidens stride onto battlefields, sometimes dressed as men, other times just terrifying as women. There's Hervor, the warrior, who duels spirits to retrieve a cursed sword, and Brynhild, the shield-clad Valkyrie, with a chip on her shoulder and a penchant for flaming castles. Stirring stuff, but also suspiciously theatrical. Modern scholars classify these women as literary tropes. Powerful, yes, but more myth than biography. Still, something must have inspired the stories. Enter the Birka burial, unearthed in Sweden in the late 1800s, and long thought to belong to a male warrior. Grave goods included a full set of weapons, gaming pieces, and 2 horses. But DNA analysis in 2017 boomed female. Cue scholarly uproar, because the idea of a real woman buried with the regalia of a high-ranking officer sparked a re-examination of gender roles in Viking martial life. Yet not everyone's convinced. Some argue the weapons might have been ceremonial. Others note that many Viking women were buried with swords, but rarely with armor or shield fragments. Could they have been symbolic? Possibly. Could they have fought? Also possible. Historians are still pulling threads, which seems fitting, given how much the Norse admired weavers of both cloth and fate. But let's not forget the real-world physical training required. Swinging a sword isn't like performing a TikTok dance. It's bone-snapping labor. You'd need strength, stamina, and probably a high pain threshold. That said, many Viking women lived physically demanding lives, hauling water, butchering livestock, defending homesteads. It's entirely plausible that in the chaos of raids or settlements under threat, women took up arms. Not as frontline soldiers, perhaps, but as impromptu defenders. Think of them as the Norse equivalent of the farmer with a shotgun trope. One Norse poem hints at female fighters disguised as men. Another references women training boys in swordplay. And there's that scene from the Gesta Danorum, a 12th century Danish work where a band of women fights alongside men at the Battle of Braveller. Is it history? Folklore? Fever dream? No one knows, but it adds to the chorus of maybes. What we do know is that Viking society valued courage and honor more than gender conformity. A woman who picked up a sword in defense of her kin might have been celebrated, or at least grudgingly respected. One scholar cheekily suggested that Viking men, upon seeing their wife cleave a thief with an axe, would probably say, "She's a keeper." Let's not overlook Valkyries either. These mythic beings weren't just death angels. They were choosers of the slain, deciding who lived and died on the battlefield. Usually depicted as armored women on horseback, Valkyries reflected how power, death, and femininity could intertwine in Norse cosmology. If you're a young girl growing up in a society where death rides a mare and has a braid like yours, you might grow up thinking war isn't only a man's game. Back in your longhouse, the debate rages in the form of saga recitations by firelight. Did your great-aunt really help repel that raid? Or was she just very good at yelling from rooftops? Either way, you keep your father's old axe under the bed, just in case. Because, whether or not you're a shield maiden, you know this. When the fog rolls in and you hear footsteps on the gravel path, no one is more dangerous than a Viking woman who's been managing goats all day and still has energy to fight. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the legend of the shield maiden won't go quietly into the fjord. You're standing in a smoky hall, beneath wooden beams, your best woolen dress brushing against the fresh rushes on the floor. Around you, people laugh, clink drinking horns, and occasionally belt out off-key stanzas from the Edda. But your eyes are fixed on the gift before you, a brooch of silver filigree set with a small amber bead. It's your morning gift, and it says more about your new marriage than all the drunken toasts combined. Marriage in Viking society wasn't just a matter of love. It was an alliance, a negotiation, and let's be honest, a financial transaction laced with ceremonial charm. And you, bride of the hour, are both participant and asset. But don't worry, you're not being handed over like cattle. You've got negotiating power, your own dowry, and if your mother trained you well, a list of demands longer than the bride price. Let's break it down. The marriage process usually involved several stages: the betrothal, where families discuss terms, the dowry, your family's contribution, and the bride price, his family's payment to yours. This wasn't a buy a wife situation. It was more like invest in future stability. The morning gift, given the day after the wedding night, was meant for you alone, yours to keep, yours to control, even if things went south later on. Historians still argue whether the morning gift originated as a compensation for lost virginity or a symbolic gesture of trust. Either way, it was legally protected property, and some women amassed considerable wealth through these gifts: land, livestock, or precious objects tucked into carved chests with iron locks. Remember those keys you carry? One of them probably fits this chest. Courtship rituals weren't exactly rom-com material. A man might approach your family with gifts. Think woven cloth tools or a particularly fat sheep, and hope for approval. No flowers, no poetry. Just trade goods and sincerity. That said, Viking poetry does mention love, especially in skaldic verses where men compare women to treasure or ships. Romantic, eh? Depends on how you feel about being likened to a well-built longboat. But it wasn't all arranged marriages and barter-based flirtation. Some sagas mention elopements, secret liaisons, and clever women who orchestrated their own matches. One tale tells of a woman who challenged her suitor to lift a boulder before she'd consider him worthy. Talk about setting the bar high, literally. Wedding ceremonies varied across regions, but a few elements were common: hand-fasting, shared drinks, and blessings from pagan gods. A statue of Thor might preside over the affair, while the bride placed her hair into elaborate braids, symbolic of her transition from daughter to wife. Sometimes a sword was passed between families to seal the union. Other times, livestock just changed hands in a quiet corner. Once married, your role as wife wasn't passive. You managed the household economy, advised your husband, and retained legal rights. If your husband disappeared on a raid and failed to return after 3 years, you were free to remarry. And if he was mistreating you, well, divorce was an option. Yes, divorce. Viking women could initiate it. Grounds included physical abuse, neglect, or just serious dissatisfaction. There's even a recorded case of a woman divorcing her husband because he wore low-cut tunics and groomed himself too often. Apparently, looking too pretty was a red flag. Take notes. In fact, post-divorce, you could reclaim your dowry and morning gift. Property laws in Viking society often protected a woman's assets better than some later European systems. And since families were always concerned about alliances and reputations, a dignified split was preferable to a scandalous one, which means your great aunt Halla, who went through 3 husbands and kept the best farm on the fjord total legend. Of course, not all was bliss and autonomy. Marriages were still bound by social expectations, and not every woman had equal leverage. Slaves, called thralls, had little to no say in their unions and often served their masters' households in ways far beyond cooking. That darker truth underlies the romantic gloss and mustn't be ignored. Still, for many free women, marriage was a negotiation, not a submission. You might spend your wedding night in a smoky loft beside your new husband, but your eyes are already on the pantry stores, the goat herd, and the location of the axe in case he starts acting funny. That morning, gift tucked beneath your bed. It's not just silver, it's security. And when you walk through the village the next day, hair unbraided, now keys swaying and back straight, people don't just see a bride, they see a new power center in the making. Because in Viking society, marriage might start with a sword on the table, but it ends with you holding the reins. It's just past dawn, and you're already elbows deep in sheep's milk and passive-aggressive sighs. Welcome to your kingdom, the Longhouse. The smell is a heady blend of peat smoke, salted fish, damp wool, and a slight undercurrent of goat rebellion. While your husband sharpens axes on distant shores, you rule this timber-framed fortress with the efficiency of a general and the creativity of a chaos wizard. Daily life inside a Viking longhouse isn't glamorous, but it is non-stop. These long, narrow buildings were the heart of the homestead, combining kitchen bedroom, pantry workshop, and depending on the season barn. You're sharing your home not just with family, but with animals, servants, and the occasional guest who has just one story to tell and stays for a week. Privacy, adorable concept. Your day begins with fire, literally. You stoke the hearth using dried dung or birch bark and make sure the smoke hole is behaving. The central fire not only heats the home and cooks your meals, but also smokes the fish hanging in bundles above. You once tried hanging socks up there. Never again. Next comes breakfast. Everyone gets a ladle of barley porridge, maybe some dried apple if it's a festival day. You ration honey like it's treasure because it is. Your daughter complains about the texture, and you remind her that in Greenland they eat boiled seal blubber and consider it a delicacy. Perspective is everything. After the meal, it's chore orchestration time. You send the thralls to muck out the animal stalls and mend fencing. Viking society, for all its poetic flourishes, operated on a stark hierarchy. Thralls, enslaved workers, were property. You might own several inherited or acquired through trade. Their treatment varied from household to household, but they were expected to work long hours without complaint. Still, your job isn't just bossing people around. You spin wool weave cloth, make cheese, preserve food, carve tools, manage accounts, and perform minor surgeries when necessary. You're a walking survival manual with a braid. The loom is your throne. It stands tall, perhaps by a window catching the morning light. Weaving is slow, rhythmic, and oddly meditative. The patterns you create, diamonds, chevrons, runes, have been passed down for generations. Some serve practical uses, others have spiritual meaning. Historians still argue whether certain motifs were used to ward off illness or bad luck. All you know is that if someone messes up your warp threads, there will be consequences. Textile production in Viking households wasn't quaint, it was central. Clothing was expensive, labor-intensive, and symbolically powerful. You controlled the production of the very garments that defined status. A man might brag about his sword, but without your dyeing, spinning, and stitching, he'd be freezing in a potato sack. Meanwhile, you're also keeping a mental inventory of food stores, how many smoked hams are left, whether the pickled cabbage is fermenting properly, and if that one sheep with the attitude problem is faking her limp. This mental spreadsheet is more critical to the family's survival than any epic poem. And since you handle the household keys, it's up to you to decide who gets access to what when and why. Social life also flows through the longhouse. You host feasts, funerals, and the occasional awkward matchmaking dinner. You mediate disputes between neighbors, usually about livestock, sometimes about ghosts. You know everyone's secrets, and you keep most of them. Most. Evenings are quieter. The family gathers around the fire. Your son recites part of a saga he heard from a merchant. Your daughter glares at the spinning wheel like it insulted her. Someone plucks at a lyre. You prepare a salve for your mother-in-law's mysterious rash and offer it with a smile that says, "Yes, I remember what you said about my stew last week." Despite the constant motion, there's dignity in the longhouse rhythm. Your labor isn't invisible. It's revered. Neighbors know who has the best linen, the tastiest mead, the most obedient thralls. Your longhouse is more than a building. It's a reputation machine. Visitors leave not just fed and warmed, but quietly impressed. And yes, sometimes it's exhausting. You've daydreamed about sailing away to Byzantium or swapping places with that seal bather in the fjord who claims to have seen elves. But as you stretch out on the sheepskins at night, the fire dying down your keys, clinking faintly beside you, you realize something: this place, noisy, smelly, and utterly alive, is yours. Because while the sagas sing of sea kings and sword wielders, real power in Viking society often smelled like cheese and smoke and wore an apron. The hearth is quiet tonight, but you are not alone. You sit beside a carved chest now yours and lay out parchment rolls, deeds perhaps, or a ledger of livestock owed. You've just buried your husband, and while grief lingers like the smoke in the rafters, something else curls beside it: authority. In Viking society, widowhood didn't mean retreat. It often meant ascent. When a husband died, especially one of status, his wife could inherit a considerable portion of his wealth, land, livestock, even trade rights. And unlike in many later European cultures, this transfer wasn't purely ceremonial. You, as widow, could manage the estate outright. Congratulations! You're now both household head and local power broker. Historians still debate the exact percentages, but evidence from law codes suggests that widows had strong inheritance rights. They could sue, buy, sell, and even redistribute property to heirs as they saw fit. In some cases, they took on roles previously held by their husbands, overseeing trade routes, hiring mercenaries, or sponsoring community feasts. If anyone raises an eyebrow, you raise a ledger. Numbers don't lie. Picture a small market town, say Rebay or Kalpong. You arrive with 2 thralls and a cart of well-bundled goods. Your late husband's former trade partner eyes you warily. But when you rattle off current prices for amber and list 3 alternate shipping routes to Dublin, he leans back and nods. Respect. Widows also held ceremonial power. At funerals, they could determine the scale of sacrifice or direct the construction of grave goods. If your husband was high ranking, you might even supervise a ship burial. Yes, the kind where the dead are sent to sea with their possessions, and in rare and possibly exaggerated cases, attendants. Viking lore romanticizes these rituals, but archaeological finds suggest they weren't everyday occurrences. Still, the decisions made at such funerals left ripples for generations. And let's not skip over storytelling. Widowhood gave you control over legacy. What tales are told at gatherings? Who's remembered fondly? Who's conveniently left out? You shape the memory of your family with a well-placed pause or a subtle edit. Your late husband once tried defense with a goose. That part may get lost in the retelling. Of course, power had its costs. You had to be sharp. Land disputes could erupt like brush fires. Cousins you haven't seen in years suddenly reappear questioning the will. And if you remarry well, things get even more complicated. Depending on the region, your new husband might gain control of some assets, or he might not. It's a legal tangle worthy of a saga subplot. And yet many widows didn't remarry. They didn't have to. With wealth status and autonomy, they could live independently, managing farms, fostering children, or even acting as legal guardians for younger kin. One record from Iceland mentions a widow who oversaw 3 farms and had 2 skalds poets in her service. She also reportedly kept a hawk. Make of that what you will. In the eyes of the law, widows had standing. They could appear before the Thing, the Norse legal assembly, and argue cases. One widow sued over a fence being moved 2 feet into her pasture. She won. Another disputed the terms of a dowry posthumously claimed by in-laws. She won too. Moral of the story: don't mess with a Viking widow who knows her boundary markers. Widows also maintained religious roles. In households that clung to the old gods, they might oversee rituals, preserve sacred objects, or keep ancestral altars. After Christianization began, many still held sway as cultural conservators, telling the old stories, lighting the old fires, even while new priests preached Latin from pulpits. By late evening, the longhouse is dim. You light a small oil lamp and run your fingers over the carved edge of a wooden spoon, your husband's favorite. You remember his laugh, his snore, the way he used to mutter about barley taxes. You miss him, but you don't crumble, because this isn't the end of your story. You wrap the documents close to the chest and tuck the keys back into your belt. Outside, snow begins to fall, softly blanketing the earth in silence. Inside, a new voice speaks yours. Because in Viking society, when the head of the house dies, the true spine often stands up. The fire crackles gently as you crush juniper berries between your fingers, their sharp scent curling through the smoke-thick air. Around you, a ring of women hums low and steady, weaving sound into spell. Tonight, you are not a housewife, not a widow, not even a shield maiden. Tonight, you are something older, something sacred. You are a seeress. Viking religion didn't just include women. It often centered around them. The Norse cosmos was a tangled web of gods, spirits, and shadowy forces, and women especially, those known as volur, were believed to walk its threads like spiders on dew. The vulva, plural vulur, was a female mystic part oracle, part priestess, part community therapist. She traveled between settlements, performing soothed, a kind of magical ritual that included chanting trances and occasionally some unsettling staff waving. Seeresses were both feared and respected, capable of calling down visions, interpreting dreams, and even reshaping fate. If the gods were the sky's loud chorus, the vulva was the quiet whisper you ignored at your peril. You might recognize this from sagas where kings and warriors consult female prophets before going to war. One particularly eerie vulva appears in Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, recounting the world's birth and its fiery end. She speaks with detached certainty, as though she's already seen everything twice and found it mildly disappointing. But were these women real archaeologists? Think so? Graves in Scandinavia have been found containing staff's herbs and ritual tools, some even with exotic items like henbane, a hallucinogen blue, glass beads from the east, and metal wands. One famous grave in Oseberg, Norway, included 2 women, lavish grave goods, and a ceremonial cart. Scholars still argue whether one of them was a vulva, a queen, or both. And here's a fun fringe tidbit. Some believe the vulur's staff symbolized the world tree Yggdrasil, making her a sort of living bridge between realms. Others point out the staff's resemblance to shepherd's crooks and suggest that managing sheep and managing fate weren't so far apart after all. Being a vulva wasn't just a part-time gig. It came with societal expectations, spiritual burdens, and sometimes danger. The role often required sexual abstinence or deliberate transgression of gender norms. Some rituals involved dressing in elaborate robes. Others demanded isolation fasting or the ingestion of mildly terrifying substances. It's not all moonlight and feathers. It's headaches and cosmic headaches. The gender dynamics here get especially fascinating. While male gods like Odin occasionally practiced cedar, it was considered ergi, unmanly, and shameful for men to dabble in this feminine-coded magic. Odin did it anyway, of course, because he was Odin and cared little for labels. But that tension between gendered magic and divine power offers a glimpse into how Viking culture both enforced and challenged its own rules. Even non-serious women had spiritual responsibilities. You might oversee family rituals, blessing newborns with carved amulets, leaving offerings for land spirits, or burning herbs to guard against illness. Some homes kept a household dees, a protective, ancestral spirit, often envisioned as a female figure. Was she a ghost? A minor goddess? Grandma with boundary issues? Historians disagree. In times of hardship, failed crops, sickness, too many ominous dreams, you might gather, the women burn juniper and perform low chanting rituals remembered from childhood. You wouldn't call yourself a vulva, of course. That's a title, not a hobby. But in that moment, the gods might still be listening. With the Christianization of Scandinavia, these roles changed, or rather were hidden. Pagan rituals were outlawed, and volur were rebranded as witches' heretics or relics of superstition. But in rural corners and whispered songs, the old ways lingered. Some rites were disguised as harmless customs. Others vanished completely until, that is, archaeologists started unearthing staffs and herb pouches in graves and asking awkward questions. Today, when people read sagas or visit reconstructed longhouses, they sometimes ask where the magic went. It never left. It just changed clothes. The Norse world was never purely masculine, or logical, or warlike. It was strange and cyclical, and profoundly shaped by women who lit fires, read omens, and spoke softly to things no one else could see. The fire fades to embers now. You tuck your herbs into a linen pouch, press your staff into the earth, and hum the closing notes of an old ritual. No one claps. This isn't for show, it's for balance. Because in Viking society, the future wasn't found in swords or sails. It was whispered in visions, and most often by a woman. You stand at the edge of the thing, an outdoor assembly where justice trade deals and neighborly insults all compete for airspace. The wind catches your cloak, and someone gestures toward the speaker's stone. You're not a bystander today. You're here with a case, and legally, you have every right to speak. Welcome to Viking law, where gender roles were a bit more flexible than you'd expect from a society best known for looting monasteries. The legal landscape for Viking women was both practical and surprisingly advanced. In many regions, especially Iceland and parts of Norway, women could inherit land divorce. Their husbands reclaim dowries and serve as witnesses in court. You might not sit on a jury, but you could sue your neighbor for sheep theft or challenge a cousin over a disputed inheritance. And if that cousin underestimated you, that's his problem. Viking law codes, like the Gragas of Iceland, contain specific statutes addressing women's rights. For instance, a married woman needed her husband's permission for certain transactions, but widows and unmarried women could act independently. And if a woman was wronged, say through assault or defamation, there were formal compensation structures in place. Not always fair, not always enforced, but written down, and that mattered. Divorce rights were especially robust. Either spouse could initiate the process, and reasons ranged from adultery and violence to fashion choices. No joke. One saga recounts a woman divorcing her husband because he wore low-cut tunics and took too long fixing his hair. You may laugh, but in a world where honor was currency, appearances mattered. Historians still argue about the limits of these rights. Were they universal? Likely not. Class, region, and kinship played huge roles. A high-status woman from a powerful clan could bend the rules. A farmhand's daughter had far less leeway. But the framework was there, and it was sturdy enough to make later medieval laws look positively draconian by comparison. Now let's talk betrothal law. You might think of engagement as a mutual promise, not in Viking terms. It was a contract involving families, witnesses, and sometimes livestock. If someone broke the agreement, compensation was expected. And if you were the woman involved, you could sue. Wills were also part of the picture, though not always formalized. Oral declarations carried weight, especially if spoken before witnesses. You might stand in a hall, keys jangling, and declare your son the rightful heir, provided he stops insulting the ale. That statement, if properly recorded or remembered, could hold up in court. Another quirky tidbit Viking law included specific phrases you had to say to make things official. Declaring divorce, for example, required you to state it in 3 public locations: the doorway, the bed, and the thing. Imagine shouting, "I divorce you," in 3 increasingly awkward settings while your ex fumbles with the goat feed. Then there were property protections. A woman's dowry and mourning gift were usually hers to manage even after marriage. If things ended badly, she could demand their return, sometimes with interest. Some women amassed impressive fortunes this way. A saga might not mention her battles, but you can bet she had the nicest mead cups at the feast. And here's where the keys come back into play. Ownership wasn't just about paper, it was about control. If you held the keys to the storeroom, the accounts, and the ancestral brooches, people listened when you spoke. Legal theory is one thing, everyday power is another. Let's not forget the darker edges. Viking law, for all its moments of fairness, still operated within a patriarchal frame. A father could force a daughter into marriage, and enslaved women had virtually no legal protection. In many cases, justice depended on your social network more than the letter of the law. A clever woman could navigate this world, but it required guts, memory, and an excellent poker face. Imagine, for instance, a property dispute between you and your second cousin. He brings his uncle and two farmhands as witnesses. You arrive with your daughter, your loyal thrall, and that one neighbor who owes you 5 coppers. You recite the land boundaries, reference a contract from 12 winters ago, and drop a casual mention of the time your cousin miscounted sheep. Case closed. As the thing breaks up, people mill about sharing news and bread. You tuck the court ruling into your cloak and stride back toward the longhouse. Behind you, whispers start. Some are admiring, some are annoyed. All agree on one thing: you're not someone to be trifled with. Because, in Viking society, law wasn't just for chieftains and warriors. It was a game of memory and presence, and the women who played it well often came out ahead. You tug your cloak tighter as the wind off the Atlantic howls across the prow of your ship. Behind you, bundled children doze against sacks of grain and woven blankets, while ahead, somewhere beyond that gray fog, is Iceland, or maybe Greenland, or maybe just a patch of rocks your husband swore was a strategic settlement location. Either way, you're voyaging, and you're not alone. Viking women didn't all stay home weaving fate and feeding goats. Many of them traveled across seas, through forests, and into entirely new worlds. The image of the raiding Viking male dominates popular history, but archaeology and saga literature tell another story. One of women who settled, governed, and shaped the expansion of the Norse world from behind the rudder and the loom. Take Iceland for starters. The Landnámabók, Iceland's medieval book of settlement, lists several women as pioneers. One of the most famous, Odd the Deep-Minded, settled parts of western Iceland after a failed attempt to make a Norse colony work in Scotland. She didn't just build a house, she claimed land manumitted slaves and founded a Christian cross before most people in Iceland even knew what Christianity was. Her funeral was legendary. She was buried upright in a ship on a ridge facing the sea. Queen Move. Historians still argue how common such female leadership was, but the presence of high-status graves and legal texts naming land-owning women suggests Odd wasn't alone. Archaeological evidence supports this too. In the graves of early Icelandic settlers, female remains are often buried with brooches, keys, and tools, signs of authority, not just ornamentation. Greenland is another fascinating frontier. Viking women voyaged there alongside men to form the short-lived Norse colonies. Life there was harsh, the winters brutal, and supplies scarce. But women helped maintain fragile economies, manage farms, and produce textiles vital in a place where survival often came down to layering. There's even speculation that Greenland women developed specialized techniques to conserve wool and make garments tighter, warmer, and less itchy, a kind of medieval Patagonia. And then there's the juiciest possibility of all women in Vinland. That's right, North America. The Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red both mention Norse expeditions to a land across the sea. One character, Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, not only voyages to Vinland, but gives birth there, making her child Snorri the first known European born in the Americas. Gudrid later returns to Greenland, travels to Rome, and ends her days as a nun. Try fitting that into a Tinder bio. Did other women make it to Vinland possibly? The sagas hint at entire households moving. If true, these women weren't tourists. They were settlers building homes, tending livestock, and possibly battling mosquitoes the size of small ravens. Of course, life abroad wasn't all discovery and fresh air. It came with risks, shipwrecks, sickness, hostile locals, and seasonal depression. Still, many Norse women chose or were chosen to go. Some were wives of explorers. Others were widows seeking new land. Still others may have been enslaved or brought as laborers. Not all were free, but their presence shaped the culture of these settlements in lasting ways. One fascinating fringe theory that Viking women brought not just wool and grain, but folklore stories, lullabies, ritual chants which helped create a shared identity in these remote outposts. While the men carved runestones and negotiated with skalds, women were transmitting memory. The ships themselves were built with expansion in mind. The Nar, a sturdy cargo vessel, could hold whole families' livestock supplies and enough dry fish to feed a cranky toddler through winter. You perched between sacks of barley, and your mother-in-law might spend weeks at sea braiding hair-mending sails, singing to keep spirits high. And yes, probably yelling at someone to stop leaning over the edge while the stew is boiling. By nightfall, you spot a strange coastline. It's rocky, covered in low grass, with cliffs that look like sleeping trolls. You've reached the edge of the known world, and what's the first thing you do? Build a fire, lay out food, start the loom. Because wherever Viking women went, they didn't just survive, they settled. And in doing so, they made new worlds feel like home. You kneel beside the grave, pressing a hand into the cold earth. The burial mound rises gently above you, covered in moss, and the whisper of wind through grass. This is no simple resting place. It's a message, a display, a declaration that the woman buried here mattered, and not just to her family. In Viking society, the dead didn't just vanish. They lingered in memory and stories, and most vividly in the items they were buried with. For women, these grave goods were more than possessions. They were clues, sometimes even loud declarations about their status roles and mysteries. Take Birka, for example. In a Swedish grave, once assumed to belong to a male warrior, archaeologists found weapons, gaming pieces, horses, and armor. But DNA analysis revealed the buried individual was female. The implications rattled the scholarly world. Was she a military leader? A symbolic burial? A mistaken identity? Historians still argue over the interpretation. But one thing is clear. This was no random peasant grave. Most women's graves include brooches, often oval and made of bronze, intricately worked with knot patterns and animal heads. These weren't just pretty, they held up the apron dress and often functioned as status markers. Wealthier women had matching sets, sometimes imported, or inlaid with silver. You could practically date a burial based on brooch style, much like archaeologists now categorize 1990s fashion by the rise of the jeans. But it wasn't just jewelry. Women were buried with tools: scissors, spindle whorls, looms, weights, symbols of domestic power. In a society where cloth production was essential and skilled weaving equaled wealth, these tools were badges of honor. Imagine being buried with your favorite laptop or stand mixer. Same energy. Other items suggest long-distance connections. Grave sites have yielded silk from Byzantium beads from the Middle East and frankincense residues. That's right. Your Viking ancestor may have rocked saffron-dyed silks, while her husband still thought bathing was a monthly option. Weapons in women's graves. They exist, though rarely. Some include knives, axes, or even full swords. Debate rages about whether these signify warrior status or ceremonial symbolism. One fringe theory posits that women buried with weapons may have belonged to families engaged in feuding or were protectors of the household in their partner's absence. Or maybe they just wanted to make sure they had options in the afterlife. Some graves go even further. In Oseberg, Norway, 2 women were entombed in a ship burial complete with a carved sled, richly embroidered tapestries, and buckets of apples. Yes, apples. Scholars have long speculated that one of the women may have been a high priestess, even a vulva. The care with which the burial was constructed suggests reverence, mystery, and no small amount of logistical effort. Imagine coordinating a grave that involves carpentry, cooking, and textiles, and it wasn't all grandeur. In smaller graves across Denmark and Iceland, women were buried with their most trusted daily objects: wooden spoons, iron pots, and amber beads. These quieter burials still speak volumes. They tell us what mattered, what was kept close, what was chosen to accompany someone into the unknown. Historians still puzzle over the practice of burying women with seeress staffs. Some resemble shepherd's crooks. Others are topped with curious knobs or metalwork. Were they tools of prophecy, social symbols, walking sticks for the spirit world? Theories abound. What's certain is that these items weren't included randomly. They were deliberate, weighted with meaning. Even the position of the body mattered. Some were laid flat on their backs, with arms at their sides. Others were curled in fetal positions or turned toward cardinal directions. One grave in northern Norway had a woman facing due west, a direction associated with the dead in many Norse traditions. Coincidence? Likely not. By late evening, the grass has settled again. You rise, brushing soil from your hands. The grave behind you doesn't just mark a death, it reasserts a life of weaving, brewing, advising, maybe even fighting. A life so significant that her community offered wealth, goods, and labor just to bury her properly. Because in Viking society, how you were buried spoke volumes about how you had lived. And the women who commanded the richest burials, they didn't just pass through history, they helped shape it. The hall is dim, firelight flickering on the wooden beams, and someone is halfway through a tale involving betrayal, a stolen cloak, and a goat that possibly witnessed a murder. You lean closer, mug in hand, as the skald's voice rises. This isn't just entertainment, this is immortality. And tonight's protagonists, cunning women, wronged wives, and battle-hardened matriarchs who don't need swords to kill a mood or a man. The Icelandic sagas are one of the richest sources of Viking-era storytelling, blending history legend and the occasional supernatural detour. And while they're often viewed as testosterone-heavy, they contain some of the most complex and fascinating female characters in pre-modern literature. Let's start with Hallgerd Longlegs from Njal's Saga. Beautiful, sharp-tongued, and unapologetically proud, she manages to cause more bloodshed through passive aggression than most warriors do with axes. She starts feuds, ends marriages, and famously refuses to offer her husband a lock of her hair to make a bowstring in battle. Result: he dies. Casual hair refusal as marital execution. Bold move. Then there's Gudrun Osvifsdottir, the emotional center of Laxdæla Saga. She marries 4 times, each marriage more complicated than the last, and displays a political acumen that would make Machiavelli blink. In one of her final scenes, her son asks who she loved most. Her answer: "I was worst to the one I loved most." Mick, drop. Historians still argue whether these saga women reflect real social dynamics or were literary exaggerations. But what's clear is that they weren't simple side characters. They had motives, agency, and voices, often loud ones. They made decisions that rippled across families, communities, and occasionally generations. And these stories weren't whispered in corners. They were recited publicly over fires in longhouses and feast halls. Everyone knew them. Children memorized them. Travelers repeated them. The tales became collective memory, and the women within them became cultural touchstones, warnings, icons, inspirations. There's also Un, the deep-minded. Remember her from earlier. Her story appears in the Laxdæla Saga too, where she's credited with organizing a fleet to settle in Iceland after her male relatives were killed. She arranges marriages, allocates land, and builds a church. She's so respected that her funeral, described in some detail, involves ship burials and open admiration from all attendees. Not bad for someone who didn't even swing a sword. These characters weren't idealized. They were layered. Some were manipulative, some loyal, some terrifying. But they all reflected something essential: the reality that women in Viking society were active participants in life's drama, not just backdrops. Quirky detail. Saga women often use epic insults. A well-timed phrase about cowardice appearance or family lineage could trigger duels, divorces, or even full-blown feuds. Verbal combat was its own blood sport, and many of the best verbal sparring matches came from women who knew exactly how to twist a sentence into a dagger. Even supernatural elements don't diminish their gravitas. When saga women appear as ghosts, witches, or dream figures, they still command respect. The dead woman who haunts a farm because she wasn't buried properly. People listen. The dream vision of a seeress warning her granddaughter about marriage. Taken seriously, these spectral women linger like unfinished verses. Of course, there's always the question of authorship. The sagas were written down by men, often monks or clerics, but the oral tradition likely preserved these stories for generations beforehand. It's entirely plausible that women helped shape them, telling their own versions, emphasizing different moments, or whispering edits while grinding grain. By the end of the night, as the skald finishes the tale and someone starts up a melancholy tune on the lyre, you realize something: the women of the sagas weren't idealized mothers or passive wives. They were architects of action, holders of grudges, brokers of peace, and icons of memory. And whether their stories were rooted in what or fiction, they still linger in the smoky corners of Viking imagination, draped in wool and wisdom. You bend over your loom, the rhythmic creak of wood echoing through the longhouse. Threads stretch taut before you, and your fingers dance across them with the same confidence others reserve for sword hilts. Outside, children play with carved figurines. A dog barks at a raven, and somewhere in the distance, someone is probably arguing about fish prices. But in here, it's you and the loom, and you're weaving more than cloth. In Viking society, domestic skills weren't the lesser domain. They were survival tools, economic engines, and sometimes even symbols of seduction. The line between loom and sword wasn't as clear-cut as it sounds. Let's talk textiles. Cloth production was complex, time-consuming, and crucial. Women spun raw wool into yarn, dyed it with plant-based pigments, wove for blue madder, for red onion skins, for gold, and then wove it into garments, sails, and blankets. Each step required skill, and each step offered a form of quiet power. Historians still argue whether certain colors were reserved for elites or if pattern variation denoted clan identity. What's agreed on is this: high-quality textiles were a form of wealth. Your woven cloak could be traded for livestock. Your embroidered apron might signal status during feast days. A well-dyed tunic could even draw the eye of a potential suitor. This wasn't just Pinterest-level crafting. Viking women were entrepreneurs. Some managed household textile workshops. Others exported their cloth across trade routes stretching from Dublin to Kiev. One archaeological find in Hedeby suggests that a woman oversaw a small-scale production site, complete with looms, dye vats, and imported thread. Eat your heart out, Etsy. But weaving didn't stop at wool. Women also created linen from flax, a process involving soaking, scraping, and drying, a procedure so arduous it was often done communally. Imagine 6 women laughing, gossiping, and possibly plotting while elbow-deep in flax slurry. That's not just work, it's a political network. Now, shift gears. Let's say you're preparing a seduction meal. You bake barley bread, seasoned with dill churn honey butter, and serve it beside a stew spiced with imported cumin. Your target arrives, eyes the feast, and you tilt your head just so. The message is clear. I can feed you, clothe you, and manage your estate better than your brother ever could. Domestic skill weaponized. Sagas often highlight this blend of home and influence. In one tale, a woman named Hildegunner lays her husband's blood-stained cloak on the lap of a chieftain to incite revenge. Not with threats, not with tears, with laundry. Historians still chuckle over the power move. Even romantic exchanges featured textiles. A bride might gift her new husband a hand-woven tunic stitched with runes or personal emblems. If he didn't appreciate the craftsmanship well, that probably said more about him than her. One fringe theory even suggests that certain garments were imbued with fertility blessings, stitched in patterns resembling fertility goddesses or seasonal cycles. Because why not combine comfort with cosmic significance? But domestic life wasn't all flirtation and fluff. Making cheese, for instance, was a battlefield. One wrong temperature, and you've got a rancid mess instead of winter sustenance. Fermenting fish, delicate art, managing a smokehouse, straight up chemistry. And don't even mention managing the pickling barrels unless you want flashbacks. In all this, women were knowledge keepers. They memorized herbal remedies, calendar cycles, and agricultural signs. They taught their daughters to recognize good dye plants and avoid the mushrooms that made Uncle Bjorn see floating goats. Their work preserved not only bodies, but culture. And then there's the literal weaving of fate. The Norn's female entities in Norse mythology spun and snipped the destinies of gods and men alike. Their cosmic thread mirrored the domestic thread. To weave was to create. To cut was to end. Every clack of your loom echoed in the myths. Even poetry recognized this blend. Skalds described desirable women as weavers of beauty and compared domestic sounds to battlefield music. The idea that a woman could conquer through cloth was not just metaphor, it was reality. As the day fades, you finish the final row and tie off the threads. You smooth the cloth, lay it carefully aside, and stretch your shoulders. Outside, the warriors might boast of their scars. Inside, you know the truth. Cloth wears longer than skin, and a woman with a loom can outlast any sword. Because in Viking society, the domestic wasn't secondary. It was foundational, and in skilled hands, utterly irresistible. The stranger steps into the longhouse, dripping rain and curiosity in equal measure. His cloak is foreign woven of finer thread dyed with strange purples. His beard is oiled, his shoes suspiciously clean. He bows awkwardly, not quite sure if he should address the woman at the hearth. You glance at him, arch a brow, and continue ladling stew. Welcome to Scandinavia, traveler. One of the lesser-known perspectives on Viking women comes not from the sagas, but from foreign accounts. Arab travelers, Byzantine envoys, and Christian missionaries all left behind. Glimpses sometimes baffled, sometimes admiring of Norse gender dynamics. And their reactions, well, they range from intrigued to mildly horrified. Take Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab diplomat who met a group of Rus, likely Norse traders, along the Volga River. He describes their customs in vivid detail, some accurate, some suspiciously tinged with cultural shock. His most famous passage describes the funeral of a chieftain, during which a female slave voluntarily joins him in death. The ritual, deeply disturbing by modern standards, includes alcohol chanting and a grim ceremony involving multiple elders. Historians still argue whether this was a unique instance, an exaggeration, or a confused retelling of a symbolic rite. What stands out, however, is the presence of women in powerful ceremonial roles. The Angel of Death, as Ibn Fadlan calls her, orchestrates the proceedings. She directs men, prepares the ritual, and acts as spiritual guide. She is feared. She is respected. She wears many keys. Other Arab sources noted that Norse women were bold, outspoken, and surprisingly autonomous. They were seen walking freely in public, managing trade stalls, and sometimes even debating with men. For cultures with more segregated gender norms, this was startling. One observer compared Norse women to men not as an insult, but as an admission of parity. Byzantine records echo similar sentiments. Norse women who arrived as part of diplomatic entourages or Varangian households were noted for their distinctive clothing, especially the oval brooches and layered tunics. These garments, foreign and elegant, often caught the eye of court chroniclers, who described them in tones of fascination. One text notes that Norse women wore their hair long and loose in a way that signaled both status and danger, a reminder that appearances could be declarations. Christian missionaries, on the other hand, were less complimentary. Shocked by pagan rituals and the visibility of female religious roles, they wrote disapprovingly of witch women who led ceremonies, interpreted omens, or made sacrifices. These accounts often blurred lines between fact and ecclesiastical horror story. Still beneath the judgment, we glimpse the outline of respected community figures with real influence. One cleric described a Norse woman who refused baptism by claiming her gods hadn't yet failed her. He notes she was unmoved by threats and resolute as stone. He probably meant that as a critique. It reads like a compliment. Then there are the trade ports. In places like Hedeby and Jorvik, records show that women participated in commerce. Contracts and debts mention female names. Graves near marketplaces contain weighing scales, coins, and imported beads suggesting female merchants or artisans. Foreign traders didn't always understand this. Some assumed the women were widows. Others assumed they were servants. But the truth likely lay somewhere in between. They were businesswomen who didn't wait for permission. A quirky anecdote from a French monk mentions a Norse woman who insulted a bishop in rhyme after he condemned her household gods. He called her a witch. She called him a donkey. Guess who made it into the footnotes? Of course not. Every foreign comment is flattering. Some sources focus on Norse hygiene habits, or lack thereof. Others express disgust at shared sleeping quarters or bathing practices. But even these grumblings reveal something Viking women weren't hidden. They were visible, vocal, and unafraid to speak for themselves, even when the audience didn't understand the language. By sunset, the foreign visitor has left your longhouse, his notes full of confusion and stew stains. He'll write about you in flowery script, probably get your name wrong, and entirely miss the point. But that's okay. Because in Viking society, when strangers came calling, it wasn't the loudest man who made the deepest impression. It was often the woman by the fire, quiet, sharp, and holding the ladle like a weapon. You sit beneath the wooden beam where mistletoe once hung, watching the priest light candles instead of fire-blessing torches. The incense is heavy, the Latin incomprehensible, and the faces around you uncertain. Change has arrived not by sword, but by scripture. And with it, the gods and roles of old begin to slip into shadow. The Christianization of Scandinavia didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, uneven process that varied by region and resisted by custom. But over the course of 2 centuries, the Old Norse belief system, full of gods, spirits, rituals, and yes, powerful female roles, was gradually replaced by Christian doctrine. And Viking women felt the shift most acutely. In the old pagan world, women had held religious authority. As seeresses, midwives, or household ritual leaders, they lit sacred fires, interpreted omens, and preserved oral traditions. Their spiritual labor was woven into daily life. With Christianity came a clergy that was exclusively male, and with it, a restructuring of sacred space. Suddenly, the rituals you once led were either forbidden or absorbed under new names with men reading the prayers. Historians still debate whether this change was abrupt or assimilative. Some argue that early Christian missionaries tolerated female religious roles to ease conversion. Others say the church quickly clamped down, rebranding velour and herbalists as witches. Either way, your status shifted. You could still be respected, but your power no longer came from the gods of your grandmother. It came from staying quiet during Mass. Symbols changed too. The brooches, staffs, and amulets that once carried spiritual weight began to fade. In some cases, they were replaced by crosses often worn the same way as pendants or brooches, but bearing different meanings. Archaeological finds show a strange overlap. Graves, where Thor's hammer and Christ's cross rest side by side, like roommates who aren't speaking to each other. Domestic rituals survived, albeit rebranded. The fertility loaf you used to bake during Yule now. It's St. Lucia's bread. The charms you once carved into doorposts to protect against trolls. Now replaced by holy water and the occasional muttered paternoster. A spiritual syncretism emerged, part survival, part resistance. Christianity also reshaped law. The legal autonomy once enjoyed by widows and wives began to shrink. Canon law introduced new norms. Dowries were now church-managed. Marriage had to be sanctified by clergy, and divorce became rare, if not forbidden. The morning gift replaced by mutual devotion, which, let's be honest, never bought a goat. Some women navigated this new landscape with strategic grace. They hosted priests, sponsored chapels, or even founded convents. Christianity offered education literacy and political alliances, especially for high-status women. Queen Gunhild of Denmark, for example, wielded influence as both a queen and a Christian convert. But even she had to play the game differently. Her power, once rooted in kinship and charisma, now required papal approval. Quirky fringe detail. Some early churches in Scandinavia were built atop old pagan sites, likely to ease the transition. And guess who kept those sites in order? Local women, quietly maintaining customs while publicly crossing themselves. Dual allegiance was common, and some folklorists believe this double practice lingered well into the 18th century in rural areas. Not all stories end in erasure. Some women became saints, others chroniclers, and a few, like Gudrid, the far traveler, even bridged both eras, starting as pagan settlers and dying as Christian pilgrims. But the old goddesses Freya, Frigg, the Norns, they faded from worship, surviving only in stories whispered over spinning wheels or carved into border patterns of cloth no priest ever examined too closely. By evening, you stand beside your loom fingers, still knowing the runes, even if the priest says not to use them. Outside, children play. Inside, the candle burns low. You murmur a prayer to whom you're not entirely sure. Maybe it's both. Maybe it always has been. Because in Viking society, the world didn't end with Christianity, but something shifted, and in the silence that followed, women rewrote their power once more. You walk the edge of a forest where birch trees whisper in a tongue older than iron. Your fingers trail along a stone marked with weather-worn runes, names half-remembered, deeds half-believed. This is where she lingers, not in sagas, not in graves, but in echoes. Tonight, we listen for her, the vulva, the farmer's wife, the widow, the voyager, the Viking woman. Her legacy is layered, stitched into everyday phrases, place names and tales passed down over hearth smoke and porridge. In Scandinavian folklore, the wise woman appears as a helper, a trickster, or a prophet. She may have swapped her staff for a broom and her charms for salt, but she's there. In lullabies, in field rituals, in the careful way someone knots a scarf before winter. Many runestones bear women's names, some carved by daughters for mothers, others by wives for husbands, but a few rare and precious stand for women who claimed the space in stone without qualification. She built this bridge. She was generous. She was wise. No mention of whose wife she was. Just her. Historians still debate the extent of Viking women's influence. Some argue the sagas exaggerate their power. Others say we've underestimated them for centuries. Archaeology keeps adding weight to the latter. Every new brooch, every loom weight, every burial with spices from Constantinople whispers, "Look again." Modern women in Scandinavia often grow up surrounded by traces of these ancestors. School children hear tales of Un, the deep-minded, or Gudrid, the far traveler. Feminist historians reclaim shield maidens not just as fighters, but as symbols of agency. Artists reimagine the vulva in ink film and fiber. The legacy isn't static, it's alive. There's even a resurgence of Norse spiritual practices, heathenry Sidra goddess worship, some scholarly, others personal. Fringe, perhaps, but then again, so were the original seeresses. Museums now dedicate entire wings to Norse women. Exhibits feature their jewelry, tools, and textiles. School tours file past mannequins in woolen aprons, murmuring about keys and sagas. Somewhere in the back, a grandmother explains how her own mother used to sing a lullaby that sounded just like that. The longhouse may be gone, but her voice still flickers in firelight. And as you sit now, drifting, the image of her forms behind your eyes. She's not just one woman. She's many. The one who brokered marriage contracts. The one who read the wind and salted the fish. The one who lifted her skirts to cross icy fjords, not waiting for permission. She wasn't perfect. She was proud, stubborn, tired, clever. But she shaped her world not by storming into it, but by stitching it together, thread by thread, meal by meal, word by word. And that world cold, fierce, enchanted remembers her still. Now close your eyes. Imagine the soft creak of a loom in the distance, the scent of wood smoke curling through a thatched roof. Outside, snow begins to fall, blanketing the earth in silence. Inside, a fire crackles, and somewhere a pot of barley stew simmers gently. You feel warmth spread from your shoulders to your toes, the kind of warmth that comes from being wrapped in wool, from knowing your place in the weave of things. Around you, the air slows, the night deepens, the past folds gently around the present. You're safe here, in this longhouse of memory where strong hands once churned butter, plaited hair, and carved spells into doorposts. You don't need to speak, just breathe. Let your mind drift to fjords, forests, and halls of flickering firelight. Picture a woman's hand tracing runes into soft clay. Hear her humming low, steady, familiar. It's a song older than stories, older than stone. The keys at her waist jingle faintly. She turns to you not with words, but with a nod. You are part of her story now, a thread woven in, a name remembered. And so you rest. The storm outside may rage. The world beyond may churn. But for now, here in this twilight, between history and dream, you are held. Sleep well, traveler. But what if some of those whispers became storms? What if there were women who didn't just foresee the future, but bent it? Women who didn't wait for power to be handed to them, but carved it out of frost, blood, and silence. Queens without crowns, sorceresses feared by kings, warriors who never needed a banner to be remembered. Their names weren't always sung, but their shadows still move through snow, through stories, through you. Now follow me. Step deeper into the cold, because not every Viking legend begins with a sword. Some begin with a woman who simply refused to disappear. Tonight, we journey far north, where the snow muffles footsteps, and even the strongest voices are swallowed by the wind. You stand in the middle of a tiny Norse village, the rooftops thick with frost, the fjord frozen solid. Every chimney puffs out smoke like quiet sighs from the earth itself. The only sounds are the creak of leather boots and the low murmur of people who do not raise their voices unless they must. You walk slowly through this hush past longhouses whose doors never quite open all the way. Every window seems to close just as your gaze reaches it. But it's not you they're hiding from, it's tradition. Or maybe defiance. There are no statues, no monuments to queens here. No bronze braids, no tapestries woven with the faces of heroines. And yet you sense them. The women who once ruled, not from thrones or in battlefields, with banners waving, but in silence, in secrecy, in stubborn everyday presence. The air carries a chill that's more than just winter. It's the weight of lives that history tried to forget. Lives that still hum beneath the snow like embers under ash. A child's voice calls out, then stops abruptly. You see an old woman carving something into a beam with a dull knife. Runes, maybe, or warnings, or just her name. You don't know. Not yet. As your feet crunch into fresh snow, a whisper trails behind you, soft and uncertain. She didn't need a crown, it says. She never did. You pass a weathered post carved with a serpent and a circle. It's half buried in snow, but something about it draws you in. The village doesn't notice, or pretends not to. You're starting to see it now. This place wasn't built just by kings and warriors. It was shaped by hands that wrote no laws, raised no banners, but changed everything just the same. And tonight, you'll meet them. The snow crunches differently underfoot as you cross into a part of the village where the houses lean just a little more, where the smoke smells faintly of dried herbs instead of pine. This is where people lower their voices when they speak of her Queen Gunhild. Some call her Gunhild the Fair, others Gunhild the Wicked, but everyone remembers her. You find a seat near a hearth in a low-roofed hall where stories are still traded for warmth. There's a tattered tapestry here, faded and scorched at the edges, You can barely make out the figure stitched at the center, a woman with her hands raised, mouth open in silent speech. A raven perched on each shoulder. The old woman beside you notices your gaze and whispers. They say she could kill a man just by thinking it. Gunhild was no idle consort. She was married to Eric Bloodaxe, whose name is as subtle as a stampede. But where Eric was fire, Gunhild was smoke. She rarely raised her voice, but she rarely needed to. In the halls of power, she was a diplomat, a puppeteer, and many believed a sorceress. Not the broom-riding kind, no. This was the dangerous kind. The kind who knew your secrets before you spoke them. The kind who smiled as your plans unraveled. Historians still argue whether Gunhild truly studied cider, the mystical Norse magic often practiced by women and feared by men, or whether that rumor was just part of her period. After all, when a woman outmaneuvers everyone at court, people will call her anything but clever. One saga claims she was trained by Finnish wizards in the far north, mastering spells that twisted fate and soured the tongues of her enemies. Another claims she seduced Eric not with beauty, but with magic, though really the two often went hand in hand in the Viking mind. She was feared because she was powerful. And she was powerful because she knew how fear worked. You imagine her now, seated in a candlelit longhouse, dressed in dark wool, her fingers idle on a bowl of carved runes. A visiting noble trembles across from her. He's not sure if he's here for diplomacy or to meet his end. She smiles gently, offers him a drink, and he doesn't notice the silence that follows until it's too late. But Gunhild's real brilliance wasn't in spells or whispers. It was timing. She knew when to hold back, when to disappear into the background, and when to strike. When Eric was deposed, she didn't beg. She didn't flee. She maneuvered. And when exile came, she brought her schemes with her. One fringe account claims she later remarried a king in the Orkneys, another pawn on her strange, wide chessboard. She made alliances, ended blood feuds, and perhaps most importantly ensured her children would keep the chaos going long after she was gone, because chaos was something she understood. You take a sip from the wooden cup the old woman offers you. The tea is bitter, herb-heavy. Something about it makes you feel seen. She never raised a sword, the woman murmurs, but every man who crossed her ended up cut down one way or another. Outside, the wind howls again. Somewhere nearby, a raven croaks and flaps its wings. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. You leave the hearth behind and follow a narrow trail into the woods. Snow dusts the pine needles overhead, muffling the world like a heavy blanket. The deeper you go, the quieter it gets until even your breath feels too loud. Then you hear it, a low chant, rhythmic and raw. You creep closer and peer into a moonlit clearing. There they are, maybe a dozen girls no older than you'd expect to see at a village well. But there are no buckets here, no weaving, no laughter, just blades. Short swords, long knives, even sharpened sticks. Their faces are streaked with soot and sweat, braids tied tight, eyes sharper than steel. One girl steps forward. Without a word, she slices a line across her palm. The blood wells dark in the moonlight. Another follows, and another. Then they press their hands together, smearing the red between them. It's not just a ritual, it's a pact. This is no children's game. These are shield maidens in training, swearing themselves to each other in blood. To defend, to avenge, to never leave one behind. No men are allowed here, not because they're unwelcome, but because they're irrelevant. They speak few words, but their actions echo with something ancient, older than Viking law, older than kings. Some say this oath predates Odin himself, a bond sealed not just in blood, but in belief that sisterhood forged in danger is more sacred than any crown or coin. A fringe saga, half lost and mostly dismissed, describes one such group as the Moonblades. Supposedly, they lived in the mountains for decades, ambushing raiders and vanishing into fog. Whether they existed or not, the myth still frightens coastal warlords. One of the girls in the clearing falters. Her hand trembles. The others don't jeer, they just wait. She breathes deep, then slices the palm clean. A nod of respect ripples through the group. Mistakes aren't weakness here, only hesitation. You feel it then, a tingle in the air, like the forest itself leans in to listen. These girls may never be written into law books or sagas, but should one of them die in battle, the others will carry her name like a torch. Historians still argue whether shield maidens were truly accepted into Viking armies or whether their stories were exaggerated by romantic poets. But tonight, in this glade, they are more real than any king's decree. As the ceremony ends, one of the girls carves a rune into a tree trunk. A single mark, plain and sharp. It's not a name, it's a promise. You turn to leave boots silent on the snow. Behind you, the chants resume low, steady, unafraid. Brotherhood is for men. What you just witnessed. That was something older, wilder, and it doesn't need a name. The fjord stretches wide beneath a sky, bruised with morning light, its icy surface glinting like old silver. You step onto a narrow path that clings to the cliff's edge, following whispers of a legend not found in sagas, but passed from mother to daughter in hushed tones. A legend of women who swore off everything the world expected of them. They were called many things, traitors, witches, ghosts, but they called themselves sisters of the pact of the blade. You find an old shelter carved into the rock, nearly invisible, if not for the scratches on its lintel-ruined scars that look more like battle wounds than writing. Inside, it's dark, cold, but you can almost hear the echoes of voices long silenced. The stories say these women swore three things: never to marry, never to bear children, and never to kneel. They weren't born into priesthood or royalty. They made themselves sacred through blood, through battle, through brutal resolve. And to seal their vow, each baptized her sword not with holy oil, but in the blood of her first kill. It sounds theatrical, maybe even impossible, but archaeological teams once found a burial far from any village where 5 swords were arranged in a star around a skeleton female, no older than 30, her ribs cracked and her teeth sharpened. Nearby, the rune for freedom was etched into a flat stone. No clan symbol, no offerings, just silence. Historians still debate if this group truly existed, or if they were a fevered dream of skalds looking to sell dramatic tales. But scattered references across regions, Scandinavia, Iceland, even Greenland, hint at something consistent: women warriors who operated beyond the reach of kings, laws, and even gods. They weren't mercenaries. They didn't fight for coin. They fought to remain unowned, and while some say they disappeared, others claim they simply transformed. There's a story of a raid where a group of men vanished into the forest only for their bones to be found months later, picked clean blades still in hand. Locals whispered it was the sisters watching from the trees, always watching. You imagine them now cloaked in wolf pelts, blades tucked in boots, moving through shadow like smoke. No songs were sung for them, no stones marked their graves. But perhaps that was the point, to choose war over warmth, to live and die by a different kind of loyalty. As you exit the stone shelter, the wind picks up. Something sharp cuts through the air like laughter or steel. You glance over your shoulder. Nothing. But you walk a little faster anyway. The snow has melted in this part of the land, revealing muddy earth and early shoots of green. You tread carefully along a path marked not by stones or runes, but by hoof prints and cart tracks, faint signs of an army that once marched here following a queen who rode alone. Her name was Lagertha. You've probably heard of her half-legend, half-bloodied memory tangled up in both history and television. But tonight, we peel away the myth and find the woman beneath the helmet. She started as a warrior bride, they say, a shield maiden who fought so fiercely that Ragnar Lodbrok himself courted her with caution. She married him, bore him children, and then, like so many women, she was left behind. Some versions say he betrayed her. Others claim she left of her own will. What matters is this: Lagertha did not fade into the background. She did not retreat into mourning or lace up her boots for exile. She sharpened her blade and waited. When civil war broke out, Ragnar found himself losing. Desperate, he turned to the one person he knew could turn the tide. Lagertha didn't answer with a letter. She answered with ships. An army of outcasts followed her abandoned wives, landless farmers' women with nothing left but a grudge and a blade. She didn't just fight at Ragnar's side. She won the battle for him. And when he thanked her, she nodded once, turned her horse, and left again. Historians still argue whether Lagertha was real or just a stand-in for dozens of nameless shield maidens lost to the sagas. But the records we do have, written by Saxo Grammaticus, a monk with a flair for drama, paint her as more than myth. They call her Commander Victor Exile Queen. Later in life, she returned to rule her own lands. One tale claims she murdered her second husband with a dagger hidden in her dress, tired of his cruelty. Another says she rode into her final battle wearing white, her horse bloody from shoulder to hoof. You imagine her now, standing on a cliff's edge, wind tearing at her cloak, eyes fixed on the horizon. She's not waiting for a man. She's not waiting for permission. She's just watching the world remember her too late. The sagas tried to fold her into Ragnar's story, but Lagertha had her own, and she forced men to rewrite theirs around her. Dawn spills pale light across the forest floor as you climb a narrow path, lined with old stones, each one carved with faint symbols that seem to shift when you look too long. You're heading to a place where no war horn ever blew, but where true power was whispered, where the women of magic once held court under trees older than time. They called them Volur, or sometimes seeresses. Not witches in the modern broomstick sense, though they'd laugh at the idea. These were women who bent fate, consulted spirits, and stirred truths into potions by firelight. In the Viking world, where strength often meant the ability to swing an axe, they fought with herbs, riddles, and an unsettling sense of exactly when you'd die. You reach a low hut built from turf and bone. No one answers when you knock. No one has lived here for centuries. But step inside, and you feel it like walking into a dream someone forgot to finish. The air is thick with the ghost of rosemary pine resin and something metallic. One story tells of a vulva who predicted the fall of kings just by watching the flight of geese. Another held councils where chiefs begged her for visions, paying her in silver livestock, or once a horse painted blue. They carved runes that no one dared touch. One woman, known only as Brynja the Pale, etched symbols into driftwood that supposedly summoned storms. Historians still debate if her runes were spells or elaborate hoaxes, but none dared test them twice. There's a set of iron tools here in the corner, crooked tongs, a ladle, a rod with runic notches. Were they used for healing hexing cooking porridge? No one agrees. And maybe that's the point. The magic wasn't in the item, it was in the story. Viking men feared cedar, the most potent of magical practices, because it required surrendering control. It was associated with femininity, unpredictability, and perhaps most frightening insight. Odin himself was said to have learned it, disguising his shame. But women. Women owned it. You find a worn fur cloak folded by the hearth. Inside, tucked where a blade might rest, is a pouch of dried herbs and a thin bone wand, smooth from use. No name, no grave. Just these relics humming faintly with memory. Outside, the wind shifts. A crow calls 3 times. And for a moment, you swear you see a woman watching you from the edge of the clearing, long hair tangled with feathers. Then she's gone. Or maybe she was never there. The smell of salt hits you first sharp wet alive. You're no longer among trees, but standing on a rocky shore where longships once slept, their hulls painted in symbols that meant trade war or sometimes both. But this isn't a tale of warriors or raiders. Not tonight. This is the story of women who ruled not with swords, but with silver. They called them market queens. Not queens in the royal sense, though some were wealthier than kings, but queens of ports, queens of prices, queens of who got to trade and who didn't. You step into a market that's long gone but still breathes in the ruins. Stone benches carved with tally marks. Bits of glass beads. A rusted scale. The place thrums with old deals and older grudges. When Viking men took to the seas for raids, it was women who stayed behind. But stayed behind is a phrase that misunderstands what happened. These women didn't wait by the hearth. They built trade empires. Some operated out of Burka or Hedeby, overseeing shipments of furs, amber silk, salt, and slaves. The fjords didn't move without their say-so. One account mentions a woman named Astrid Ironhand, who negotiated trade rights with both Franks and Slavs. She couldn't read, but she had a memory so sharp, no one dared cheat her twice. Her ledgers, pebbles and bowls. Her receipts, your continued ability to walk the docks unaccosted. In fact, archaeological digs at old trading posts often uncover scales, weights, and foreign coins in female graves. For years, historians claimed these items must have belonged to their husbands. But the graves hold no male remains, no partner, just one woman, her tools, and a wealth of evidence saying I made my fortune. Historians still argue whether these women had official guilds or simply operated within family clans. But coins minted in their names, yes, really suggest they weren't just participating. They were running the show. You pause beside a collapsed stone warehouse. The sea crashes below. Imagine her here, hair-braided tight hands on hips, glaring at a Frankish sailor, trying to barter with counterfeit silver. She doesn't shout. She nods once. Two boys emerge from behind barrels, knives out. The sailor pays the proper rate next time. And sometimes, these market queens arranged marriages not for love, but leverage. Daughter to a rival's nephew. Suddenly your ships stop getting lost. Brother to the daughter of a Byzantine trader. Congratulations, now you have silk. They played the long game, and they usually won. The waves crash louder now, as if applauding. You step away from the shore, pockets full of imaginary coins and real admiration. In a world of warriors, these women made wealth their weapon. The wind is fiercer up here on a ridge overlooking the misty sea. You pull your cloak tighter, not just from the chill, but from the strange weight in the air. It's not storm weather. It's older than that. You're standing where warriors once paused before battle eyes turned skyward, hoping not for Odin's favor, but to be noticed by his daughters. Valkyries. You've probably heard the songs women with winged helmets and glowing swords descending on the battlefield like meteors. But the truth is stranger and heavier. Valkyries weren't just divine Uber drivers for the dead. They chose. They judged. They watched with eyes colder than any blade and decided which warriors would rise in glory and which would rot forgotten in the mud. A chilling kind of agency, isn't it? You see them now, not with wings or golden armor, but in visions, shared in old sagas. Tall figures in pale cloaks, faces obscured hair like wet ash watching as swords clashed below. One moment, they're walking among men, offering water before a duel. The next, they vanish, and the loser's throat is already open. Historians still debate whether Valkyries were God's spirit symbols or echoes of real battle priestesses who chose warriors by ritual. Some even suggest they originated from cults of female war seers whose job it was to interpret omens and offer approval for war. Whatever their origin, one thing is clear: Viking men feared them as much as they worshipped them. And Valkyries didn't always choose the boldest or the strongest. They chose based on something more obscure: courage in defeat, loyalty to kin, or sometimes sheer poetic timing. Die too early, not ready. Die too late, irrelevant. Die in, a moment that feels like the end of a saga. Now that's Valkyrie worthy. There's a myth about a king who tried to bribe a Valkyrie with gold to spare his sons. She smiled and placed a feather in his palm. One will die for pride, the other for peace, she said. Choose which hurts more. He couldn't, so both died. You walk further along the ridge, and a shape catches your eye. A stone circle cracked and overgrown. Some believe such places were where Valkyries landed in rituals invoked by shield maidens or dying warriors who didn't want to be forgotten. One saga even claims a woman pretended to be a Valkyrie to terrify an invading warband, and it worked. They fled into the sea. But these weren't angels. They weren't gentle. They were agents of consequence. When they came for you, it meant your name might live on, or that it would be erased forever, depending on their whim. Odin, for all his power, could not overrule them. And tonight, as mist curls around your boots and the sea moans below you, wonder if you fell here now, Would they come? You're not sure, but you hope they'd at least remember your name. The fog thickens as you descend toward the valley, where ancient assemblies once gathered. You hear murmurs ahead, dozens of voices low and tense. You're walking into the Viking legal gathering. A mix of parliament, courthouse, and open-air drama, the Thing was where disputes were settled, alliances were forged, and oaths were sworn. But this story isn't about laws or loud warriors. It's about a woman who slipped past every rule and rewrote them just by showing up. She had no name in the sagas, only a nickname, the Speaker in Boots. The story says she disguised herself as a man to gain entry to the Thing. Not for glory or revenge, just to speak, to be heard. That was the dangerous part. She debated contracts, sued a rival clan, even helped decide the fate of a disputed farm. And for years, no one suspected, not because her disguise was perfect, but because no one expected a woman to wield logic like a sword. You imagine her now, thick cloak cap, low over her eyes, voice calm but sharp. Her words don't tremble. And when an elder challenges her knowledge of law, she counters with a precedent from the saga of Njal. He squints, nods once, and lets it go. Historians still argue if this tale is real or allegory. But in 2017, researchers uncovered legal records from Iceland's Gragas laws mentioning female plaintiffs and wives with land rights. So, maybe the story wasn't so far-fetched after all. One version ends with her death old, peaceful, and still unrecognized. But when they prepare her for burial, they find a silver brooch tucked inside her tunic, engraved with her true family crest. A quiet confession, or maybe a final joke. You step into a clearing where the assembly once met, just a ring of stones now moss-covered and forgotten. The wind stirs again, and for a moment you hear her voice. Confident, precise, not loud, but unshakable. Because sometimes rebellion doesn't wear armor. Sometimes it wears boots and speaks in perfect legal phrasing. You find yourself walking toward a low hill where a burial mound rises from the earth like a sleeping beast. It's older than any church around here, older than the sagas, older maybe than writing itself. And for centuries, it told a lie. The grave was grand, lavish, some said. Weapons laid out with ritual care. 2 horses sacrificed and buried alongside. Shields, axes, gaming pieces, and tools for war. Of course, it belonged to a man. Who else would be honored this way? And so it remained, cataloged, footnoted, printed in textbooks as the grave of a high-ranking Viking warrior. Until someone tested the bones. She was a woman. The news rippled through the academic world like a boulder dropped into a still lake. Some scholars squirmed, others denied. A few quietly cheered. You walk slowly around the mound. No sign indicates her name. Just a plaque with archaeological jargon that doesn't come close to what's actually buried here. Not just a body, but a bias. Historians still argue how this woman came to be buried like a warrior. Did she lead troops win battles? Or did her community recognize power that modern minds refuse to see? You imagine her life backwards, from death to youth. A girl learning to ride before she could write. A teenager sparring with her brothers. A woman who fought not for fame, but because she could. And when she died, whether in bed or in battle, her people knew exactly how to honor her. One fringe theory suggests She belonged to a warrior caste of women whose records were deliberately destroyed during Christian conversion. Another claims she was buried as a decoy to mislead grave robbers. But her bones say otherwise: muscle scars on the shoulders, stress fractures in the legs. This was someone used to armor, used to riding, used to war. You pause beside a small trench where archaeologists once dug. The tools are gone, but the impression remains. So do the questions. How many more graves like this have we misunderstood? How many were quietly labeled anomalies and ignored? The wind picks up brushing loose snow across the mound. Somewhere above, a raven circles silent. You can't help but think, if her grave changed everything, how many stories do we still have to unearth? You follow a winding trail deeper into the woods, where moss carpets the stones and the trees grow close like sentinels guarding secrets. Here, where the sunlight barely filters through, you reach a clearing encircled by ancient oaks, each one scarred with marks, not from tools, but from ritual. This was once sacred ground, a place where the old gods were honored long after the Christian cross began spreading through Scandinavia like a slow, relentless tide. And at the heart of the resistance was her. No saga gives her a name. Only whispers survive a woman who refused conversion. A woman who fought not with armies, but with fire. The tale begins with a priest arriving at her longhouse, a wooden crucifix in hand and a sermon on his lips. He called her sinful. She called him presumptuous. When he returned the next day, he found only smoke, the longhouse burned to its foundation, the stones blackened with defiance. You imagine her in that moment, not angry, not afraid, just done. Done with being told which god to kneel to. Done with watching neighbors submit. Done with pretending. She vanished into the forest, they say, with a dozen followers, widows' healers' daughters with calloused hands. They took little with them, but flint, dried herbs, and their gods. There in the woods, they held blots, sacrifices to Freya and Thor, secret rites under full moons. No bloodletting, no drama, just offerings of honey bone and song. They defended sacred groves with sharpened sticks and silent fury. Historians still debate if this resistance truly existed, or was a product of folklore trying to preserve pagan pride. But evidence surfaces fragmented charms carved with Norse symbols hidden inside Christian graves' runes beneath chapel floors, altar stones repurposed as church steps. One story claims the king himself sent a small army to capture the women. They found nothing but empty huts and carved warnings in the trees. The gods don't need temples, one read. They live in roots. Years later, when missionaries retold the tale, they claimed she died alone in a cave. Others said she ascended in smoke. But in these woods, you feel something else, a presence, stubborn and quiet. Like moss that outlasts fire. As you leave the clearing, you notice a small figure carved into a tree trunk. A woman, arms raised, eyes closed. Below her, a single word, Freystat, sanctuary. She didn't need to win. She just needed to endure. The rain starts gently, just enough to ripple the puddles and soften the sound of your steps. You pass a hillside where the grass grows tall and wild, and just beyond it, a crooked wooden stage sits abandoned. It doesn't look like much now, but once it rang with verses that could shatter reputations and rattle kings. She was called the Cursed Skald. Skalds, Norse poets, weren't entertainers. They were memory keepers, rumor starters, and propaganda machines rolled into one. Most were men, but she wasn't. No one remembers her birth name. They only remember her song. It began after a war. A king, cruel, proud, and paranoid, had won a battle but lost half his people to famine. He blamed the gods. She blamed him. And so she sang. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Just a few lines whispered at market stalls and over cooking fires. Verses about gold hoarded while children starved. About prayers ignored. About a crown that weighed less than a conscience. The song spread like smoke light, invisible, inescapable. At first the king laughed. Then he ordered her silenced. But no one knew where she was. She was everywhere. Her words were inked into the margins of family Bibles, scrawled on the walls of outhouses, stitched into the hems of cloaks. Historians still argue whether she truly existed or if she was a composite dozens of anonymous voices blurred into one rebellious myth. But a fragment of her verse was found carved beneath a collapsed chapel beam, silver rots in sealed boxes. But shame flows like spring melt. A chilling discovery, and one that prompted scholars to reevaluate who could wield power in oral societies. One tale says she was eventually caught, brought before the king himself. He demanded she recant. She simply recited the final verse, looking him in the eyes. That night, his hall burned down. Coincidence, perhaps. But they say anyone who hears her last lines dreams of drowning in gold and regret. You pause beside a fallen oak, its bark etched with a few barely legible lines. The rhythm feels familiar, like footsteps you've walked before but never noticed. Words, after all, are weapons, and some are sharper than swords. You hike into a remote valley where even the birds seem cautious. The trail vanishes beneath tangled roots and moss-covered stones, and then quite suddenly there it is, a burial mound too humble to be noticed by treasure seekers, but too deliberate to be forgotten by time. Archaeologists unearthed it only a few years ago, expecting another local chieftain or farmer's grave. What they found instead left them speechless: a woman, buried with a crucifix, a sword, and a small leather pouch full of dried herbs. Warrior, nun, healer, or all three. The bones told part of the story. She was strong, unusually so. Scar tissue along her ribs, slight damage to her right wrist, likely from swordplay. Her teeth were worn flat in a way common to herbalists who chew roots or grind mixtures by mouth. And that crucifix, placed deliberately at her chest, hands folded beneath it like a monk, but tucked beneath the hilt of the sword in a pocket sewn inside her tunic, was a carved rune alder, meaning life. Historians still debate who she was. Some argue she was a Christian convert who couldn't quite give up her warrior past. Others think she was a healer, forced to adapt as the world around her shifted. A few even suggest she was a spy sent by a monastery, but loyal to the old gods. The grave wasn't looted. No signs of haste, just care, thought, respect. One fringe theory calls her the warrior nun, a name half mocking, half reverent. The tale goes that she protected a village in secret, hiding her sword beneath her robes and her beliefs beneath her silence. When raiders came, she fought not to kill, but to protect. A paradox in leather and linen. You kneel at the grave site, now your fingers brushing the edge of a stone smoothed by time. There's no marker, no name. But the space hums with contradictions, like a chord that never resolves. She doesn't need to be solved. She needs to be remembered. Because sometimes the most honest stories are the ones that don't quite fit. The land here is too quiet to be royal, too modest to be powerful. But this was her domain. No throne room, no crown. Just a sprawling estate hidden among hills and hedgerows, where decisions carried the weight of law and power moved in soft footsteps. They called her the Quiet Crown. No saga details her battles. No skald sang her praises. But records dry, fragile matter-of-fact mention her over and over in disputes, settled taxes negotiated, and warriors redirected with a single word sent by messenger. She never left her land, they say, but the land never left her either. You walk a cobbled path through what used to be a courtyard. The stones are uneven, as if they've shifted in memory of her pacing. She wasn't a ruler by name. She was a matron, a landowner, a lady of the manor in the loosest sense. But when neighboring clans argued, they came to her. When storms wrecked trade routes, she rerouted them. When feuds brewed, her letters arrived first and usually ended things before blood was spilled. Her influence didn't scream. It simply worked. Historians still argue whether she had formal titles or was simply a powerful widow whose estate outlasted the politics around her. Some speculate she inherited wealth and land after her husband died, managing dozens of households and scores of farms. Others believe she never married at all, rising through the ranks via cunning and kinship ties. There's a story of a warband who marched through her territory unannounced. They never made it past the second village. Not because they were attacked, but because the local blacksmith, brewer, and baker all refused them service. Her messengers had moved faster than their swords. You imagine her sitting by a small fire quill in hand, composing another one of her famously brief directives. Let them leave quietly. If not, let them leave cold. No signature. She didn't need one. You pause at the remnants of a stone wall where vines now climb what once held her seal, 3 braided lines meant to represent grain thread and iron. Grain for survival, thread for alliances, iron for when neither of the first two worked. She didn't rule a kingdom. She ruled outcomes. And sometimes the most powerful throne is the one you never sit on. Mist rolls across the landscape like breath from the earth itself, softening edges, blurring boundaries between past and present, between story and silence. You step into a grove where the grass grows unevenly dotted with half-toppled stones and twisted branches that seem to bend just slightly toward memory. This is where they end, or rather, where their stories dissolve, unfinished, erased, or simply misplaced. The sagas mention their names in passing, a line here, a whisper there. Shield maidens with no fate recorded, queens whose deaths are never explained, seeresses who vanish between chapters. Their lives are tucked into the margins, footnoted, forgotten, and yet, like the faint outlines of a rune long worn smooth, you can still trace their shape. One scholar once wrote, "History is not what happened, it's what was written down." And for Viking women, so much was never written, or rewritten, or buried so deeply in legend that even their bones are shy to speak. You kneel beside a small grave marker, uncarved. A storm likely erased whatever name once lived there. Still, someone left a bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth, fresh by the look of it. A quiet offering to a woman without a story. Historians still argue whether the missing pieces are due to patriarchy Christianity or the sheer chaos of oral culture. But while they argue, the wind tells different tales of a girl who fought in the Battle of Clontarf, of a widow who negotiated peace between three feuding clans, of a skald who vanished at sea but whose verses still echo on the waves. You look up, and for a moment, it feels like they're all here, ghosts without vengeance, memories without sharp edges, just watching, waiting, maybe not to be remembered with glory, but simply to be acknowledged. The snow begins again, soft as breath. And as it falls, the sea, the stones, and even the trees seem to whisper back their names. Not loudly, but clearly. The storm has passed now. The voices fade into snow. The shadows curl gently into the earth. And all that's left is the hush that follows remembrance. You walk slowly back along the path, the stories of queens and shield maidens trailing behind like threads woven into the wind. The cold is softer now, not biting, just present, like a memory you don't quite want to forget. The fire inside the old longhouse is low, just embers. You settle near it once more, the same place where Gunhild's smile first stirred the air, and Lagertha's footsteps echoed down the fjord. You feel the warmth now, not just from flame, but from knowing these women were real. Maybe not always as the sagas described, maybe not always in name, but in action, in consequence, in resistance they endured. Not all battles are fought with swords. Some are fought in silence and sacrifice, in surviving when the world insists you should not. And as you lie back, eyes heavy, breath steady, you can still feel them. Not haunting you, just being near, watching, resting, enduring. Because even if history forgets, memory doesn't. Not really. So sleep now. The fjords are quiet. The snow falls softly. And the women who ruled without crowns keep watch a little longer.